Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Meagan Strout, and I'm the CEO of Tack Advisors. And today I am joined by my friend and colleague and confidant, executive coach, Jillian Hufnagel. I'm going to go ahead and chat a little bit about her experience in just a moment. But while everybody's joining, I wanted to quick launch a poll that we have just to understand who's joining us today. So we'll go ahead and get that started. Feel free to fill that out when you have a moment. And so as I mentioned, today I'm joined by Jillian Hufnagel. Jillian is an OG with us here at Tack Advisors, one of our first executive coaches who's been partnering with us and our executives and their EAs to build these really great high-performing teams. And it's been so inspirational to get to work next to you and with you with these clients over the past 3 years. I've learned so much from you. And so that's actually what brought us here today, because we've seen a lot of common threads or some patterns with our clients over the years, and thought it was worth sharing it with the world of what we found to be, the secret sauce to high performing workplaces. And so thank you so much for joining us today, Jillian. I really appreciate it.
It's absolutely my pleasure. You and I could probably spend all day talking and just put it on like a live stream, and people could hop in and out and probably enjoy it. I think it's also helpful for the audience to know that the majority of my career, I have been in technology companies. I just wrapped up a stint in my 9th startup. I have been receptionist, office manager, AA, EA, chief of staff, head of culture and human capital, and I did start my coaching back in around 2018. So I'm both a practitioner and a coach, which I think is really useful because it helps me stay kind of relevant in what's going on with the industry. I learn from my clients, I learn from my peers like Meagan all the time, and then I also learn from my on-the-job experience.
Yeah. I mean, you're like chief of staff times 3 or 4 now for successful companies with billion-dollar exits, and have this really great way of connecting both with executives and assistants, like you said, because you have been in the seat, you sat in the seat, you've worn the shoes, you continue to wear the shoes. And so I agree, it keeps you super relevant for our clients, which I really appreciate. So
yeah. I want to add to that too. So for our audience, I think it's also helpful to know that I have been in companies that have absolutely failed. I've been in companies that have dissolved. I've been in companies that have gone bankrupt. I recently just processed myself and 16 other people out of a company in a layoff. And so I really want to encourage the audience to engage today and ask questions that are relevant to what they're experiencing in their personal work lives, because between Meagan and I am sure we can definitely tackle some of your questions.
We've seen a lot. We've been around the block a few times. So let's dive into this topic, and that really is, because you've worked in a lot of places, you've coached a lot of different organizations. From your perspective, when you see a company that's thriving and you see a company that's failing, is there, generally speaking, a common thread?
Yeah, I think there are two things that are always in play when a company is either accelerating towards success or decelerating towards, whether it is a closure, a layoff, potentially a sale that is not going to be a good outcome for the business. There are operational dysfunctions and there are cultural dysfunctions, and they are always intrinsically linked. And, I think it's important. We've got a lot of folks that just said, they're in privately held organizations. And a lot of the folks that are with us today are executive assistants and operations professionals, among others. The operational dysfunction will show up in a number of ways. It will be things like people consistently not showing up to meetings on time or prepared. Individuals consistently asking to jam in meetings because it's whatever problem du jour that they're experiencing. And so they will railroad the organization with whatever's important to them, rather than being respectful of an operating rhythm and participating in it as like a regular drumbeat. So that's kind of like some operational dysfunction that will show up in organizations that are decelerating towards moving away from success.
Mm-hmm.
culturally, the undertone of those types of things are artificial harmony. People kind of being in meetings and agreeing to things that they don't actually agree to. And then you'll see these activities where, they step outside of the meeting and then they go talk to 2 or 3 other people and they come up with a new plan. And then they go and grab the decision maker and they manipulate the decision maker into that new plan. So companies that have these types of operational and cultural dysfunctions within the company tend to be less successful than companies that operate with a regular cadence, organizations that know how to agree and commit and hold each other accountable to things, and teams, like really, really high performing teams that build healthy conflict into their regular communication styles.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot to unpack there. What I heard you say was a handful of things. So on the operational side, it sounds like not having a good foundation and structure for the operating rhythm of the business, making those agreements on, coming to work and coming to meetings on time and prepared. Maybe there isn't even a structure for what an agenda looks like for a meeting. How you're going to operate in the meeting, communicate within the meeting. So that's the operational part, but the real focus and what we want to dig into today is on the interpersonal skills within those meetings, after those meetings. That's where it seems to be there are a lot of challenges. And some of the points you brought up around, what was the word you used? Fake harmony.
Artificial harmony.
Artificial harmony. You also mentioned people who don't really commit and then go back behind closed doors. Maybe they're doing a little bit of gossiping, they're doing a little manipulating, and then that's just creating a cog in the wheel. And so is there like a common thread you see around that? To me, what initially makes me think of is people aren't effectively collaborating, and they're probably, if they're not agreeing to what is being said in the meeting, and then they're going behind closed doors and gossiping with each other, they're sort of operating from a place of judgment, or at least that's my interpretation. What would you say to that?
Yeah, before I respond, I'm going to ask a tactical question. I'm not sure if others are still seeing the poll, but I know I am, and I'm not sure if that's affecting folks' ability to kind of engage. So I just want to check to see whether or not the poll. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So this concept of judgment, actually, you and I were talking about, a few weeks ago, and that was the impetus for why we wanted to have this conversation with others and invite them to engage in it. The underlying root of most dysfunction in business is human to human collaboration, communication. And what I've learned to be true in my career is the times where I have functioned at my lowest self rather than my highest self, meaning not functioning well in a way where I can collaborate, in a way where I can support the business.
Mm-hmm.
I was deeply in judgment. I was in a position where I was judging leaders for making decisions that I didn't agree with. I was judging people for showing up in a way that I didn't think was appropriate or ethical.
Mm-hmm.
And it became clear to me that a lot of the communication dysfunction that existed in all companies since I became aware of that moving forward was related to this concept of judgment being present. And when you are deep in judgment, you're completely in your own ego. When you're in your own ego, whether you are an administrator or you are an executive or you are a manager or an individual contributor, you're focused on what's in it for me and why I like or don't like what's in it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is the business exists to execute on its mission,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that mission is. And they can execute on that mission without you.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to find a space in your work experience where you can be more effective within your own role and within your own function, toggling out of judgment is probably the biggest area of uplift that you can get as an individual contributor, whether you are the senior executive assistant to the CEO or you are the administrative assistant to a director. It doesn't matter. If you can look inward and say, am I refusing to get on board with the decision that the business made because I am an ego and I am judging the decision rather than getting on the bus and just moving forward with everybody?
And I think there's really quick, I want to kind of just like disseminate the difference between like having good judgment and being in judgment. Because I actually think when people say having good judgment, it means you have discernment, right? You have good taste. You understand, what is being asked of you or what you need to do moving forward. And, I'm going to use examples of, being an executive assistant, right? You're using discerning taste on what meetings should be going on your executive's calendar based on the priorities that are set. Or if it's something more tactical, like you're using your discernment on the types of gifts or swag for a team to boost morale. That's discernment, not judgment. The type of judgment we're talking about here is when you are operating in this place of ego where you are have an opinion, but it's opinion that's sort of more rooted in like kind of what you want or what you believe versus the opposite of that, which is coming from a place of compassion. And I'd be curious to know from you, Jillian, like how do you typically shift in a place of going from judgment and compassion, on a typical day-to-day basis?
The place I struggle with most, even after going on this journey for years of trying to replace my own judgment with compassion, is bad drivers. I can't stand it.
Bad
I can't
drivers
stand
really gets you. Yeah.
Like, I don't know if any other folks that are joining us today, have kids and you see someone driving down your street really fast and you're like, what a beep, right? Like, how dare you? You think your time is more important than mine. You've got a place to go, but you have no respect for my family, that my children are out playing in my yard, right?
Yeah.
So like, I just immediately go into like this, how dare you? You are behaving in a way that is unacceptable. And I just go into this judgment. And so for me, trying to replace that behavior with compassion is a daily activity. There's this really, really beautiful book called The Art of Happiness, and it's co-authored by Dr. Howard Cutler and the Dalai Lama. And I found it when I was on a work trip a number of years ago, when I was really, really struggling with how I was relating to my work and the deep judgment that I was in. And it just happened to be, I walked into the Hudson News at the airport and it's shining down on me from the shelf. And I'm like, okay, I clearly have to buy this book.
Yeah.
And the thing that was really interesting to me about it is this concept that in your mind, judgment and compassion cannot coexist at the same time. And so when you are in judgment, if you replace that thought with compassion, which is, this is another human sitting in front of me. They don't deserve to suffer, nor do I. I'm choosing suffering by being in judgment. I'm choosing suffering by being in frustration, aggravation, disappointment, whatever that energy is. If I choose to toggle into compassion and I think about, okay, I may not agree with this decision. I may not think that it's the best decision for the business. And I can look at this other person and I can acknowledge that they're another human making a decision on imperfect information. Okay. If they're making a decision on imperfect information, can I put myself in Jessica, it is The Art of Happiness by Dr. Howard Cutler and the Dalai Lama. I'll put the link in there a little bit later too. If I can replace that thought process and toggle myself out of my ego, which is judgment, I can turn my brain into business readiness. And I can say, if I can be in business readiness in the seat that I'm in, let's say I'm the executive assistant to a VP, and there's another executive that is doing something that I think is a decision that will hurt my VP and my team. Okay, they're making a decision now off of imperfect information. They may or may not have more information tomorrow or the next day, but they're making this decision today. How can I influence for better? And so my influence for better might be a behavioral pattern like I'm asking questions to seek clarity. And if
Mhm,
I'm asking questions to seek clarity, could that drive the conversation of decision making in another path?
mhm,
And can I do that without assigning a value to whether or not they do it?
mhm,
Because if I assign a value to the fact that they don't do it, even though I tried, I'm back in ego again.
mhm. No, it Walt Whitman said, be curious, not judgmental. And what you said is, do that. I do the same thing. I'm going on this information gathering safari whenever something doesn't seem right, right? Before I go into immediate judgment mode, which is my, like, I think most people, but especially my like natural, baseline for me. I'm an ENFJ. That J is strong in my Myers-Briggs. And I've had to do a lot of work on this over the years to swing the ship in the other direction. But what you mentioned about like being curious, asking those questions to yourself, asking them to the person who's making the decision to better understand. That is such an easy way to shift from judgment to compassion. And what you're saying about your dislike of people who drive. There was actually a really funny meme on Instagram like a week or two ago I saw where it was like, instead of getting upset by the person who's driving really slow in front of you or the person who's speeding by you, think about what's the reason why they're doing that. Are they driving really slow because they have a sheet cake for a birthday in the backseat that they don't want to fly through? Is it because they're driving fast because they're trying to rush somebody to the hospital? Like there's so many things there's so much information you don't know, right?
Mhm.
So asking yourself those questions, could it be this? Is it that? Why are they making this decision? And then, like you said, shifting out of that and just going right to the source and asking them, can I have some more information about why you made this decision? I'd really like to understand. Here's some things maybe you don't know about what's going on with my executive. And this is the same thing for executives. I have to shift out of judgment a lot as a CEO and as somebody who manages a team. I've had people bring things to my attention that didn't seem quite right, where there was conflict between two employees and only one employee brought it to the table. So instead of just taking their side, like it sounds like what they're telling me is complete information, information gather, ask questions, and then go to the other person and say, hey, this was brought to my attention. Can you give me a little bit more color here on what's going on? Can you walk me through what happened? Because that whole adage of there's two sides to every story, there's usually like actually 15 sides to every story, even if there's only two people involved.
Yeah, there typically is, and I think it's interesting that one of my favorite humans, who's also an amazing executive assistant, who is now, I think she's the head of VP or COO of operations at her company, is Ebony Bellhumer, and she says, "Go on safari." Go on safari to get more information. And so one of the things that she coined years ago in her role supporting a CEO was, when my CEO comes to me and asks me to do something, I go on safari to gather more information. I never take specifically what the CEO is asking for as the ask,
Mhm.
right? And when I'm preparing the team to give something back to the CEO, I work with them to make sure that they're getting the additional context and support that they need in order to like kind of present and make their case.
Mhm.
And I think when you're considering, it's many of us who support executives, either in the past, currently, or may in the future, are going to experience this moment or series of moments
Mhm.
where our leader is making decisions that are not based in enough information. They don't have enough data. And so they will be making decisions that also are imperfect. And instead of us judging it for imperfect, we have this like really, really cool opportunity to say, how can I make this better?
Mhm.
I have the relationships built. I can go get more information. I can get an additional report from the CEO, CFO. I can get an additional report from, the chief people officer. I can go to the customer success team and say, what's really going on with this account,
Mhm.
right? And then I can bring that information back to the leader and I can say, hey, you mentioned that you were concerned about this thing. I went and I did that little safari, and I gathered this additional information, and I just wanted to put it in front of you. And once you've had a chance to digest it, let me know if you want us to pull together another meeting, right? And so what you're doing is you're doing that because it's what's best for the business, not because it's what's best for you, not because it's what's best for the leader that you're supporting, but because that behavior of being in compassion rather than judgment will allow you to make business ready decisions and not personally derived ego decisions.
Yep, I think that's great. And I think from an executive side, it's important too to leverage your assistants or your support staff, because you can spend a lot of time running around trying to gather this information yourself, but it's probably not the best use of your time. If the business needs to keep running, as a CEO, you need to still continue to operate. And so leveraging your assistant or your chief of staff to have those conversations, to gather those materials, to be able to make an informed decision is just a really smart use of your time. And I do that all the time with Rachel, who's my business manager, like constantly. I'm like, hey, like, especially because a lot of stuff we have documented, right? We've documented information in our CRM system. You know, there's emails, like it's easy to pull that information, but it would take me 20, 30, 40 minutes, maybe longer than that, when I can just say, hey, can you research and let me know the timeline of when these things happen so that I can make an informed decision. And so that's a really great way to leverage your assistant or your business manager or your chief of staff to make a good decision and have them be part of that information gathering safari for you.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's also important to, I'm coming from a place of 20 plus years of experience with, many, many times where I have fallen down, many, many times where I have made mistakes and I have learned from them, many, many times where I've gone through kind of like traumatic business experiences and then had to like really internalize my learnings. So coming from this place of knowledge and wisdom experience, I'm making this sound really easy. And the reality is it's not really easy to do these things, even for someone who practices it regularly. But I do think it's important, and I would love to hear from folks that are listening, how they feel about what I'm about to say, is you can have compassion and healthy boundaries at the same time. This concept of healthy boundaries is something that every single admin, executive assistant, chief of staff that I've ever coached has said, I want to get better at setting healthy boundaries. And so I think it's important to layer on top of using compassion rather than judgment in conjunction with healthy boundaries. And understanding what's your bar for I won't stay. And so for me, that's if it's illegal or immoral. And I have a set of my own morals. They're not the same as everyone else's. And so understanding kind of what your moral line is, and obviously whether it's illegal or not, knowing what your line is for when I would have to leave versus I can stay and I can set healthy boundaries around some of these behaviors. And so when you think about leaders or team members who are maybe not showing up in a way that's healthy and they're being, let's say, verbally abusive, that's a boundary that absolutely needs, like the line needs to be drawn. And you might not necessarily be able to draw the line with the specific person. You might need to go to your leader, or you might need to go to your leader's leader, or you might need to go to your HR partner and say, I'm struggling with this person's communication style. They said XYZ to me specifically. And to me, that feels like it's against kind of my moral code or the company's values code, whatever that is. And then get that additional guidance that you need to set those boundaries. And then practice them. It's not going to be easy. You may have to try a few times. You may need to articulate directly to the person, hey, when you said X, Y, and Z, it felt like this to me. I don't think that was your intention, but I want to let you know, I don't want to be spoken to like that again.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Oh, it's super scary. And by the way, it's not just scary for assistants, it's scary for executives too. And you bring up a couple of points of like, where do you cross the line? And what's the difference I've learned this in therapy about being nice and being kind, right? Because I never want to be seen as not a nice person, because I really try to live and be a warm, loving, compassionate person, even as a leader. And one of the things that my therapist has helped me learn is there's a difference between being nice and kind. Being nice is when you like bend over backwards and you don't have boundaries and you just try to do everything to placate everyone else. Versus being kind is you can have boundaries. You can say, I won't allow people to speak to me in a certain way. I am going to set like very specific expectations around what the vision and the values of this company are. And if people operate outside of that, then we're going to say, hey, you're not allowed to do this. Here's the reason why. Like, we're not going to be verbally abusive in this company. We're not going to continue to show up late to meetings. We're not going to cut people off when they're speaking. Like, all of that is disrespectful. And if you can't operate within these requirements and these boundaries, then we're happy to manage you out of the company. Because being nice and trying to just be like, oh, well, it's okay. And I'll just, I don't want to like, rock the boat and like tell people they can't do that. That's just going to continue to cause additional turmoil within the company. And that's what creates a toxic and culturally dysfunctional organization. And that kind of brings me to what the thoughts are on the companies that have a no asshole policy. Because I kind of think a no asshole policy is BS, if we're going to be totally honest. But I'd love to hear your perspective of that, because I think that's where people try to be nice instead of being kind.
Yeah. I think the policy intent is good. I think everywhere that I have seen it done has failed. And the reason that it's failed is because it's unclear. It's not defined. And so if it's not defined, it's like saying, be kind or be nice, right? Well, what's the definition of be kind versus be nice? What's the definition of being an asshole versus not being an asshole? And I think the reality is that each of us react to our environments differently. And we have such cognitive diversity in how we ingest things. So, my sister, she's an executive assistant.
I love her. Gina.
Yeah, but she's kind of like me with no sugar. Yeah. She's got this military background. She tells you like it is. I'm sure some people would say that the way she communicates is too direct or too harsh, but that doesn't put her into the asshole category. And so I think what happens is that when you put a policy together that's vague, that is kind of like a cat poster on the wall, which is like, be innovative, right? It doesn't really give the appropriate guidelines for leaders and HR professionals and managers to manage to, and it doesn't give peers the platform to manage with. So when you are in a work relationship with another person who is behaving in a way that is abusive, that is manipulative, that is for themselves and not for the business, I think those are the types of people that would fall into that negative category. If we can apply compassion and we can say, they're clearly suffering, they're another person who should not be suffering. Is the business doing what it needs to do to assess why they're not thriving? And this is where you go from decent performing teams to high performing teams. High performing teams see that the business is responsible for assessing whether or not someone is thriving and giving them the guidelines to thrive. And that includes how they show up in the way that they communicate. That includes how they show up in the way that they produce their work and they're accountable to their work. If the business is not setting the tools and the structures and the behaviors in place to assess and wrap themselves around someone who is struggling and very, very quickly either work them towards better or work them out, then the business is actually propagating the allowance of the behavior. And this is something that hit me really, really, really hard when I heard it. And it's so true. Your culture is not what you say on paper. your culture is indicative of the worst behavior that you allow to continue in your business.
Yeah.
Like, that's nuts.
Mm-hmm. But going
The
to the,
worst behavior.
yeah. And culture is also the sum of every behavior. It's not just the executive's behavior or the worst person, but everybody plays a part in it, right? And so if you're allowing a culture of people living in judgment, of people, as you like to call it, BMW, bitching, moaning, and whining, gossiping. I know, I thought that was so funny. Well, I don't even know if we can post this on YouTube later. I don't know if they allow swearing online, but
I'll just bleep it out. So we need to attribute BMW
yeah.
to the person that I am the biggest girl fan of, Cy Wakeman.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote a number of books, but one is No Ego, another is reality-based rules in the workplace, and her most recent book is Life's Messy, Be Happy.
Yeah.
And all of them are phenomenal. But in her book, No Ego, is where she coined the phrase BMW. And she gives you very, very specific tools to respond to the BMW. So I'll give the audience an idea of what we're talking about. So you're sitting either in your physical office or your proverbial office, and someone either, messages you on Teams and like demands that you answer the call, right? So, we pick up this Teams call from, who, the resident complainer.
Mm-hmm.
The resident
Living
complainer.
in judgment, by the way. They are in judgment. They're
They're
parking their BMW, their big judgment car right in your office. Yep.
They drive their BMW, their car, which is BMW bitching, moaning, whining. They drive it right into your Teams. You are now being held hostage by this person in BMW. And you can choose how to toggle them into self-reflection, or you can feed them by giving them more gas.
Yeah.
And I am guilty of giving gas, and I'm sure every other person on this call, whether you are an executive, an admin, or an IC, you are guilty of giving someone else gas and saying, yeah, let me pour that on you while you complain, and I'm going to stoke your fire for you. And you can sit in my office in your BMW for another 25 to 35 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is when someone is in BMW mode, Cy Wakeman says things like, don't encourage them to continue to say the things that they're saying, but ask them things like, oh, that's interesting. What's your role in this?
Mm-hmm.
And wait.
Silence
And
is
so
amazing.
silence is amazing, right? And then if they immediately go back into blaming the other person or blaming the budget or blaming macroeconomics, you say, sure, yeah, I know those things. You did mention that. But what is your specific role in making this better? What's like one thing you could do to make this better? And so what ends up happening is the engine shuts off. They're not in the BMW anymore. They have gone from ego and judgment
Mm-hmm.
to self-reflection and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two very different places in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
You've gone out of limbic brain, which
Mm-hmm.
is fight, flight, or freeze, right? You've gone into a position where you are now back in it. You've gotten that person back into executive function.
Mm-hmm.
They can now make a business ready decision. And, the other thing that's really interesting to me, and this has come up so much lately, and it is like this really weird theme in my life right now of like people accusing other people of being woke, and the difference between being compassionate and being woke. And I think it's a really important thing to call forward, because I myself have been accused recently of being woke in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I really have been doing like this digging to assess, what does this mean? Like, what are people perceiving my behavior as woke?
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy working from home. And so, yes, I support a work from home culture. I'm actually very effective at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been accused of being woke because I would prefer to work at home than an office. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And in my exploration of this, the people that have been kind of like towing this line of this thread are individuals who don't actually know how to toggle out of judgment and into compassion.
Mm-hmm.
They are ego almost all of the time.
Yeah.
They are former executives who I've worked with, who I know are wonderful humans, yet they are stuck so deeply in what they think is the right way to work that they can't seek to understand. And they couldn't possibly comprehend how someone would not only be effective, but enjoy working outside of an office. And I think this is really interesting because when you think about what's happening in the economy today and what's happening with these leaders and companies demanding RTO, return to office, they're not seeking to understand whether or not they're going to drive further engagement. They're in ego. Their ego tells them, well, it worked before, so it's going to work again. Everybody back in the office. And that's not a business strategy to drive execution and engagement. That's executives and ego. There are some companies that are doing it well, and they are actually assessing their workforce, and they're asking their workforce, RTO 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. What are the things that you need to be successful in your life? And I think that's another thing that kind of falls into that category of being accused of being woke, is like, I want balance in my life. I don't want work-life balance. I want balance in my life. And work is a part of my life. And that's a very interesting nuance that a lot of employers don't understand. The balance for me is not the same balance for Meagan.
No.
It's not the same balance for all of the wonderful people on this call today.
No.
And so I think this is a really, really big value driver for teams and leaders who are willing to understand what is truly driving engagement in my employee population. And I can guarantee you it's not an arbitrary RTO demand.
We could talk about RTO all day because I see it all day long on the recruiting side of my business. There are also people who are candidates of mine who are like, I only want to be in the office. I function best around people. I'm an extrovert, and working from home has been absolutely miserable the past couple of years. So like it goes on both sides, right? And then there's some people who are like, I love the opportunity to be hybrid and be, sometimes in the office, and then sometimes like, have this actually brings up another point on judgment, but and sometimes be at home. I was talking about somebody who wanted to park the BMW for me, because as a recruiter, and I think just as a person, I think people like to come and talk to me about the challenges, and I have a lot of people who are candidates and clients who call me, and I welcome it because I love to be a resource. But I've had to create a boundary. Again, kind of shifting from being nice to being kind. Like being nice would be me just sitting and listening to people all day while they have their BMW, or saying, what action do you need from me? Because some people just need a vent. Some people are looking for my perspective. Some people need help, like shifting their, focus, or what it is that they, going from judgment to compassion. They need to hear another perspective, in which case I'm like all for helping people shift their perspective. I'm all for giving, real life examples of how I've made the change. I'm not anymore for letting people just sit and vent to me and like stoking the fire. I just don't have time for it anymore. But what that reminded me of what you said is, people operate very differently in an office than they do at home. And I had a candidate who parked their BMW with me a couple of weeks ago, who was, or not even, I guess they were a client, but complaining about how their executive was showing up in the workplace, and how every once in a while he'd get upset and he'd start to scream. And I'm like, was he screaming at you? Is he just screaming? Is he just having a moment where he's having a meltdown? And I was like, because you have to keep in mind that you're in the office 5 days a week. And let me just be totally honest with you. Back when I worked in an office 5 days a week, I was not the best version of myself either. The fact that I get to work from home and I'm behind a screen, and if I'm having a moment, I can shut my computer and go for a walk. Nobody's seeing me have a moment. When you're in an office 5 days a week and that executive is under an incredible amount of pressure, right? You have the board going after them, you have employees going after them, you might have lost a deal. Like there's so many things that could be happening to this person. Let's like have a little bit of compassion for the fact that their job is really hard. And so, yes, I agree with you that screaming and yelling probably isn't the right way to handle it, but they're not screaming and yelling at you. They're just having a moment where they're screaming and yelling in their office. So, and so you have to kind of shift your perspective here.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I want to balance the necessity for boundaries, but I also I want to give a tactical and actionable example for the folks on the call. So if someone is not the best version of themselves, what can we do to create healthy conflict instead of artificial harmony? And so artificial harmony would be, oh, that's just how Bob shows up. Don't worry about Bob, right? Well, our jobs are to ensure that the office of whatever person that we're supporting operates efficiently. It doesn't matter who's in the role. It doesn't matter who the CEO is. If you're the executive assistant to the CEO, you don't support the CEO, you support the office of the CEO, and the office of the CEO exists to run the business, and the business exists to make good on its mission. So let's be honest, we're all replaceable, okay? Now, that being said, we can make impacts by creating space for healthy conflict. So if Bob tends to behave this way, what can we do? Well, the next time Bob starts to behave this way in the executive team meeting, we step in with our brave and compassionate voice and we say, Bob, I'm going to have to stop you because I don't think that this conversation is productive right now. And I would like to push us back towards the agenda. Can you agree to that? And Bob's going to look at you like, who the hell do you think you are, you little, and he might start yelling again. And you say, Bob, I appreciate that you are maybe not happy about the way the conversation is going. And we did come into the meeting with an agenda. I'm going to insist that we get back to it. And if you feel like you can't contribute, we can reschedule this meeting to another time. And for anyone on the call that's been in this type of experience, I would love to hear whether or not you've stepped into those brave moments and whether or not you got fired for stepping into those brave moments. I would imagine that if you did step into a brave moment like that, you didn't get fired. So I think, do we only have the, I don't know, do we have live chat, Megan, or do we just have the Q&A?
Live chat. So if anybody wants to throw their thoughts into the chat, they can do that. We certainly love it. I know people have been putting things in Q&A as well. So nice. Yeah.
I had this one experience where I was supporting a CEO and we had about 16 people in our weekly executive team meeting. I happened to be the chief of staff. We had a senior executive assistant and we had a couple other senior executive assistants who kind of would come in and rotate in and out with to help with note taking and agendas. And so my job as the chief of staff was to work with the CEO and the leadership team every week to set the agenda for that 2-hour meeting. And the CEO would just suck all of the air out of the room and he would talk for 90% of the meeting. And so we were really working towards having a more effective leadership team meeting every week. And I had only been kind of moderating the meeting and preparing the agendas for maybe a month or two. And so maybe 4 or 5 meetings in. And the CEO is talking and I just see the body language around the room. Like people are leaning back. They're kind of rolling their eyes a little, disengaged. And I said, hi, CEO, it sounds like you're saying XYZ. He slams his hand on the table and says, no, Jillian, that's not what I'm saying at all. And I said, okay, could you try explaining it differently? Because I'm not following. And literally every single person in the room, that these are executives that have been doing an executive level job for years, they all lean in and they're like, they can't wait to hear it. And we get that clarity. And so now that we get that clarity, what ends up happening is it shifts how the leadership team communicates.
Mhm.
And the VP of product pulled me aside like a week later. He goes, I don't know if you just like are a sycophant or like you just don't care about yourself. He's like, what? Like you just like lay down on the train tracks for us all the time. He's like, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it because we haven't had this level of clarity in years. And I said, well, I really appreciate the pseudo compliment. I said, but you know what? You need to start asking the same questions.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and I think there's a handful of ways you can do it, right? You were being very specific in saying, hey, I understand that you want to discuss this, but this isn't on the agenda. Can we go back to the agenda? Right. So that's one way to doing it, right? So it's sort of stopping that cycle of the person communicating. Same thing of, raising your hand and saying, hey, is there an action you would like out of this? Right? Because that also kind of stops the cycle of people being like, wait, no, there isn't an action. I just wanted to vent. Oh, okay, sorry. Because people are, when they get into it, they sometimes have such a hard time not even realizing they're in this vicious cycle of spiral. And so breaking that. Now, there's also going to be times where like you don't want to do it in public, right? Because that can stoke the fire. It's not going to de-escalate the situation. And that's when you have a conversation where you pull somebody to the side and you have that, FBI, what is it, situation, behavior, what's the I stand for?
Oh, yeah. So this is, we'll nod this to, yeah, Monique Hellstrom. Yeah, Monique Hellstrom, she was the former chief of staff to Simon Sinek. I learned this from her in a presentation she did maybe in 2018 or 2019 using a tool called FBI, and it's feelings, behavior, and impact. And so let's say, I wanted to respond to that meeting differently. We'll use that same example of a dysfunctional executive team meeting where the CEO sucks all of the air out of the room and nobody understands. I then sit down with CEO afterward and I say, hey, I have some observations from the meeting, and I'm wondering if you're open to me sharing them. CEO says yes. I said, okay, I want to share with you my experience, and here's how this felt to me. When you talked for 90% of the meeting and you did not seek to understand whether or not the room understood you, the impact on myself and the team is that we walked out of a 2-hour meeting not having a clear understanding of what we had to do next or what your expectations of us were. I don't think that was your intention. Was it? And the CEO is going to be like, well, you guys just need to figure it out. You need to listen to what I say. Okay. Well, now that you've responded with that, the further impact on me is that I don't have any additional clarity, nor does the rest of the team. Maybe should we try writing down what you're asking for? So maybe you can talk a little bit and I can take some notes, and then we can refine the ask and bring it back to the team with a little bit more clarity. FBI is something that when you use it right, it's specific to one instance. It's not a generalization. You don't say never, always, right? It's not a generalization. It's the specific instance. When you did this, I felt that. The impact on our relationship is this. And then that moves into, we can move into the concept of agreements versus expectations, because this is a good one.
Yeah. Well, and I think really quick to underline that, the first thing you said is, was that your intention? When you said, feelings, was that your intention? So again, you're not coming from a place of judgment. You're not coming from a place of, oh, you do this and it's so annoying and nobody's being productive. You're saying, here's what I observed. Here's the impact. Was that your intention? And so you're shifting from judgment to curiosity and compassion, because maybe they had no idea, or maybe it really was their intention. I don't know, but you're never going to know unless you ask. So, but yeah. Let's shift into that next sort of thing that you wanted to talk about in regards to like clear agreements and expectations, because I think that is important. Expectations are huge.
I'm going to use it to answer Kelsey's question, actually. So Kelsey says, our leadership team meetings often become people reading their weekly updates. How do you recommend managing the meeting or updating to ensure this valuable time is helpful and allows for input and decision making? Often when conversation commences, it is decided to be taken offline. So what I would do, Kelsey, is I would architect some type of, we'll call it like a project management around meeting efficacy improvement. And so there is an expectation that the meeting should improve, but there aren't agreements on how. And so what I would do in this case is I would probably put together a survey for the leadership team, for all of the people that participate in it. And I would say, how do you rate the efficacy of our meeting, 1 through 5? 1 being low, 5 being high. What would you like to see more of in our meetings? Open-ended, or you can give them a drop-down. What would you like to see less of in our meetings? Open-ended or a drop-down? Do you believe that we have an opportunity to engage other voices in our leadership team meetings? Yes or no? If the majority of respondents say yes, then you can have an open-ended question that say, who else would you like to hear from in our leadership team meetings? And then you can also have a drop-down that says, what percentage of our meetings should be decision-making? What percentage of our meetings should be discussion and debate? What percentage of our meetings should be team building? Because these are great opportunities to have team building in your regular leadership team meetings. Team building should not be waiting for the offsites. And so what I would do is I would use the results from that to create the agreement and say, out of the 7 people that responded to this, every single person said, we need to spend more time making decisions. So I've put together an updated agenda that time blocks for discussion, debate, decision making, and I want to weave in a little bit of team building. We're going to spend a little bit of time getting to know each other. They're going to be really, really low stakes activities, but you all said you wanted more of that. So can we agree and commit to running this new agenda for the next quarter? And at the end of the quarter, I'm going to survey you all again. And so this is where you go from expectations to agreements. So it's probably not uncommon that people in Kelsey's organization who are in that meeting have said, this is not a great use of our time. Yet none of them are coming forward with any suggestions on the improvement. They're potentially putting it back on Kelsey or someone else in that role who would then be responsible to influence for better. But the challenge is that administrative professionals tend to have all of the responsibility and none of the authority. And this is where we start to use agreements instead of expectations. As a parent, I'll go back to parenting. I had to physically show my children what a clean room looked like so that they could understand and agree to my expectations.
Yeah, that's a really good one, actually.
Right?
Good example.
Like years and years and years of finding candy wrappers. And I think, the last room clean out, there was a bottle of honey that was open in a bag leaking in the bottom of the closet, right? Like the things that you would never expect when you have a high functioning like frontal lobe and your executive function is like really, really high, which a lot of admins are. When you're dealing with people who function cognitively differently than you do, sometimes you have to be explicitly clear and say, these are the 7 steps to clean your room. If you don't do all 7 steps, you haven't met the agreement. And so you can kind of think about that when you're working with people in the workplace too, is question where they're coming from, seek to understand what their communication style is. And then I think the other thing that's really important, especially if you're facilitating a leadership team meeting, is architect for the different learning styles. Don't only do slides. Don't only do spreadsheets. Don't only do, just the cameras. Think about how do you switch it up so that you are ensuring that the content's being delivered in a way where it's catering to all the different styles of learners and listeners in the room. And so that's another thing you could put on the survey is, when you say, what would you like to see more or less of, you can say, slide decks, Excel spreadsheets, external presenters, etc. Depending on what type of product or service you deliver, inviting customers into a leadership team meeting quarterly is like mind-blowing. where the whole leadership team gets to hear from customers. Like, these are the types of like things that you can weave into your operating rhythm, because then you're driving empathy and compassion for the customer.
It's really hard to be in judgment when the customer is telling you exactly what they want or what they don't want, because then it has nothing to do with what you think, right? Like, the customer is telling you what they need. And so you can disagree all day long as a team, but if the customer is giving you direct feedback, well, then there you go.
Yeah.
That's really great. I love, and this is coming from a CEO or a leader's perspective around, what we were just talking about, like having expectations versus clear agreement. When you're partnering with an assistant, or even not, if you're even having communication with other members of your team, leaders, managers, it's so easy to just think, oh, this is common sense. Of course, they're going to just do this, project the way I wanted them to do it, set the presentation the way that I want it. Unless you are very, very clear about what your expectations are, that sort of tell, show, do review of, this is what I want to achieve with this employee survey that we're going to go out. Can you put together a list of questions that we can review together so that we're in alignment? Have them go do it, come back, review it. They're going to just run wild with what they think is best from previous experience or companies, expectations. And so I think that that's where things get lost a lot with executives, and just people in general with expectations. And you said there's no such thing as expectations, only clear agreements, right? And so you can't have an expectation of how your EA should work with you if that you just hired them and they've never worked with you before. They don't know your priorities. They don't know your preferences. I have some really weird preferences about the way I like things. I know that because I'm hyper self-aware, but I've only come to that self-awareness because I've worked with a handful of people over the past who've been pointed out to me and be like, oh, that's how you want it done. Got it. Cool. Right. Common sense is not so common. And quite often it's not common sense at all, right? It's about those clear agreements. It's being explicit with what you want. It's being explicit with what you need. And then once they agree to it, then it can be an expectation. But until then, you can't get upset. You can't come from a place of judgment. You can't be angry. You can't be frustrated. You have to then shift to that place of compassion and curiosity and say, why is it that this presentation is still not being done the way I want it to be done? Why is it that I'm not getting the information that I need from my talent manager about where we are with the search? Do they not know the right questions to ask? Do I need to be more explicit? There's so many ways in which you can shift and create more clear agreement. But I think it's super important from, again, going back to judgment to compassion. You can't have judgment because you haven't created clear agreement.
Actually, we have Allie asked a great question. I'll pop this to you. So when interviewing an admin to join your team, what are some good, thoughtful questions to ask a candidate to find out their judgment, work style, compassion style, etc.?
So I actually just came up with these questions, and I think these are good questions regardless of if you're hiring an admin or anybody in your company. I actually threw these into ChatGPT and had it spit these out for me, because a huge part of what I'm, shifting towards and trying to build and be more clear around at my company is how interpersonal skills are equally as important as technical skills. And I think that for far too long in the workplace, technical skills have trumped creating a collaborative and high functioning workplace. And far too long, people have kept individuals at, in a company or in an office because they build a lot, right? They bring in revenue. Well, they're bringing in revenue, but causing a ton of turnover, which is actually costing your company a lot more money, right? And so I'd rather just bring in really great people who have strong interpersonal skills as well as strong technical skills. And so these questions that I've asked are, what do you think you owe a company, and what does the company owe you? That one's been pretty profound. tell me about a time you saw, what was it? Tell me about a time you saw an injustice in the workplace or in your personal life, and how did you handle it? And then the third one was, how do you define success? And all three of those have been really, really fascinating, because we've been doing hiring at Tack. We just hired 2 new people, and we have a third person that we're extending an offer to. And I've actually given those as part of the case study. So depending on who we're hiring for, like in our case, for our recruiting coordinator case study, we gave them specific examples of like scheduling or rescheduling interviews and like things that we see pretty often. And then the second part is answering those 3 questions. And then on the talent manager side, we had them do a case study where they had to basically research open positions and shortlist candidates they think they would be a good fit. And then the second part was that. And by far the most fun part for me when reading those case studies were seeing the answers, because you learn so much about what people value. And that to me has been profound. I don't know, what would you say, Jillian?
Well, I think those are excellent. I might add, tell me what you believe your role is in making good decisions for the business.
Ooh, that's a good one for admins.
Yeah. I'm grateful for everyone participating today. Do we want to spend a little bit more time, or are we going to be wrapping up? Because you know me.
I know we're on time. I really appreciate this, Jillian. This has been super fun. Thank you
Always
so
a
much for
pleasure.
joining us today, and thank you everybody who stayed on and joined us. This is recorded, and it is going to be sent out for those of you who were able to attend, and it will also be posted on our YouTube channel. Have a wonderful day.
Hi, Jen.